session are standing by in the chat box to answer your questions. You can also use this feature to chat with other attendees. During the on-demand portion of VNATA, the chat feature will not be available. Thank you for being here at VNATA. Enjoy the session.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I am Dr. Erin Haugen. I am a licensed clinical and sports psychologist located in North Dakota, but I'm also licensed in the state of Minnesota. And I am actually very happy to be with all of you today to talk about athlete mental health during the time of COVID-19. So we're basically going to walk through a lot of different factors related to the background of mental health during this time, and hopefully help you think about things pretty holistically in terms of how you can help your athletes with some of the difficulties that they may or may not be experiencing, and then also moving forward. One of the other things that I really enjoy about these types of talks is that they're also skills and strategies that you can utilize for yourself, because your well-being certainly matters during this time as well. So this hopefully can be a talk that can be beneficial to you on a wide variety of levels. So a few caveats before we get started is that all the photos that I use are publicly available or photos that I have permission to use. This adorable little pup here, his name is Eddie. He's one of my 3 border collies, which you'll certainly see throughout the presentation. Any examples that I use during the presentations are certainly disguised to protect the confidentiality of anyone involved. And then also, if any of you are on social media, a popular hashtag that we often use is athlete mental health. It can be a really great way to get a lot of information regarding mental health, particularly during the time of COVID. So just a brief roadmap, we'll go ahead and talk about some of the challenges that the pandemic has brought us regarding mental health and well-being, talk a little bit about some of those challenges as we return to sport, and then also ways that you can support the mental health and well-being and mental performance of the athletes with whom you work. So one of the things that I think is so powerful is that the world has certainly experienced an incredible amount of disruption over the past several months. There's been an incredible amount of uncertainty in our lives, in school, and in sport. And during this phase of disruption, there have been several phases that I've seen athletes go through during this time. I think the first phase that was really prominent for athletes was an incredible amount of confusion. It came up somewhat abruptly for a lot of athletes, especially those at the collegiate level, which I predominantly work at the collegiate level. Just confusion about what's going on right now. We're going to do sports without fans. Wait, hold on, sports are canceled. And that was just something that I think a lot of athletes just really haven't experienced. And really none of us have experienced a shutdown in the world at that level. That certainly transitioned into some sadness, especially as we recognize that this was going to be present for a prolonged period. So for those that missed out on seasons or conference tournaments, the pandemic really hit in the US at a time where we were gearing up for conference and national tournaments in some sports. But also there were some athletes that experienced some relief. In a number of sports, some athletes got a spring break at the collegiate level that they might not otherwise get. That certainly then gave away pretty quickly to anxiety, just questions about, what's next? When am I going to get back to sport? What's the plan? What's our new normal? What's going on? And then also as the pandemic progressed, they really tended to see that's where depression and low motivation tended to hit for a number of student athletes. Frustrations with restrictions, wondering when this is going to end, sick of social isolation and online learning, and all sorts of other emotions that presented themselves for athletes. Now, I think that there's potentially some excitement now that sports are starting to return, certainly in the US, although this differs widely by state. But I think even though there's that excitement that sports are back, that there's also a lot of other challenges that are going to present themselves during this time. But the reality is we're returning to sport under a much different landscape than was present before. This certainly refers to COVID-19 challenges and changes related to screening protocols, physical distancing, team meetings, locations of team meetings, in-person meetings, all of those types of things. But it also refers to a number of psychological, social, and societal changes that have also presented themselves during this time. The reality is athletes and their families have experienced a host of stressors that can certainly impact their psychological functioning, well-being, and sense of safety. The calls for social justice and Black Lives Matter has not only moved to the forefront of conversations for many of us, but there's also a renewed call within athletics to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And during this process, it's also exposed many ways in which society, sports, and athletic departments have certainly fallen short in providing for mental health and well-being needs of student athletes of color. And so, in many ways, it can be easy to assume that now that sports are starting again and reopening, and many athletes are returning to sport, if they haven't returned already, that things will be easy for them. I was actually having a conversation with some sports medicine colleagues, and one of the things one of my colleagues mentioned was, how excited and happy athletes must be as sports as they're starting to return to sport. And this person had also kind of commented on how some of those challenges related to COVID are probably just going to go away and go away pretty easily and pretty quickly. And although that may be true, and I really hope that's true for people, I'd venture to guess it actually won't be that simple for many athletes. The reality is I think we've experienced it, to use the term that we're using frequently is an unprecedented time of disruption to our well-being and our mental health. And these stressors that many of us really haven't experienced at this magnitude or at this level before are certainly going to have residual effects. At the very least, there's going to be some discomfort or self doubt returning to sport after a 2 to 3 month period of being away. And then also that kind of uncertainty about what does that path look like going forward? Are sports going to continue? Will academics continue? And that real unknown is just simply a part of what we have to navigate during this time. And everyone differs in their acceptance of discomfort and unknown and skills used to cope with the unknown. So what are some of those challenges and concerns that athletes and certainly all of us are experiencing this certain time during this time? And I really, really, really want you guys to think a lot about context. And this talk is really going to be focused on viewing athlete mental health and well-being within a broader societal context. I want to start with adverse childhood experiences. Otherwise known as ACEs. And ACEs are adverse experiences that occur during childhood that can undermine one's sense of safety, security, and relationships perspectives. These are the 10 ACEs that have been identified in the research literature initially by Filidi et al. In 1998. And ACEs and associated conditions, such as living in under-resourced or racially segregated neighborhoods, frequently moving or experiencing food insecurity, can certainly cause prolonged periods of high stress. In general, and this is not pandemic related, approximately 45% of children and 61% of adults have experienced at least one ACE. Nearly 1 in 6 people have experienced 4 or more ACEs. So that's a lot of adverse childhood experiences, rendering people vulnerable to experience increased mental health concerns. And these numbers are even higher for some populations, such as women or Black men. And all of these ACEs have certainly had the potential to worsen during the COVID-19 pandemic. Low SES and social isolation are actually risk factors for ACEs, and that's been a central characteristic of the pandemic. Approximately, when we think about the context more broadly within families and abuse occurring within families, approximately 78% of child abuse is actually perpetrated by the child's parents. So when we think about the pandemic, that means these student athletes are essentially trapped at home with people who are perpetrating abuse against them, who are also under incredible financial and emotional stress. So when you think about that context, there's a lot going on there that can really undermine the safety and security for a lot of athletes who really view sport as a positive outlet and view school as a positive outlet. And these ACEs can certainly have an impact on physical and mental health. These high stress periods can negatively impact brain development related to attention, decision making, learning, or even one's response to stress. So, this COVID-19 pandemic increases the likelihood that these ACEs might occur, and the presence of ACEs then influences stress, and it can be this real vicious cycle for a lot of athletes, particularly if they're isolated from others. So the reason that I want you to think about the context of mental health and well-being right now is remember that many athletes that we are working with are going to have these experiences that are incredibly powerful for them. And so those behaviors that might be kind of confusing or frustrating for us, if we can view them with some empathy and attention to some of these challenges, that can be very beneficial in helping them navigate what's going on for them. Another contextual factor that is incredibly important is racial disparities and racial trauma. COVID 19 has a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color. For example, Asian communities experienced an increase in discrimination as a result of the outbreak originating in China. Black Americans also have a higher COVID 19 mortality rate than any other racial group in the US. Black Americans make up 33% of the COVID deaths, but only 13% of the US population. There's also numerous examples of racial trauma within the context of COVID 19. For example, recommendations to wear masks prompted concerns in the Black community that this could increase racial profiling. There's been lots of references, unfortunately, to the COVID 19 virus as the Chinese virus. And that can be very traumatizing for people who are members of communities of color, but because that's actually very hurtful and very stressful for them. The virus also highlighted ways in which structural racism exists in our country. The lack of access to protective resources and hospital care in underserved communities, many lack housing that allows for safe social distancing and quarantining, and then also many essential workers, particularly in metropolitan areas, are people of color, and that means increased exposure to the virus. So then when we consider that these athletes are functioning within this context and their family members might be in these occupations that are at increased exposure to the virus, or they might actually be experiencing racism or some of those structural inequalities, that certainly is going to increase their level of stress, which certainly relates to mental health and well-being. We certainly know that racism plays a role in mental health difficulties for individuals of color. So racial disparities and racial trauma are simply things that must be part of the discussion when we discuss athlete mental health. Then we move on to consider two other factors, financial stress and food insecurity. And I've already referenced food insecurity. So the reason that these two variables are important to consider is that there's certain demographic groups that are going to be disproportionately experiencing these difficulties. The NCAA did a survey of student athletes at the end of April. It was approximately 37,000 student athletes asking about a variety of concerns related to COVID-19. Student athletes who felt negatively about their family's financial situations reported more mental health concerns across the board. So that financial stress was certainly related to decrease in mental health and well-being. Food insecurity is defined as being without reliable access to a sufficient quality of affordable and nutritious food. For many athletes in high school and in college, school is a consistent and reliable food source for them. And with the pandemic, they were all of a sudden unable to access this very abruptly. So even their nutritional needs might not have been being met for them. And nutrition can certainly play a role in well-being and mental and also physical health. Going back to the NCAA research, there were certainly racial disparities reported in housing and food stability. For men of color, 21% reported they did not have access to enough food to meet their needs each day, which was compared to 8% of white men. Then for women of color, 25% reported they did not have access to enough food to meet their needs each day, in contrast to 16% of white women. And then we consider those individuals living alone, they also reported lower levels of food stability. So even the pandemic has threatened just basic needs related to food, potentially shelter, and finances for student athletes, both directly and indirectly. Another component that we've talked a lot about, or you've probably heard a lot about in the media, is social connections. And because of the nature of the pandemic, many connections were moved online, and there was this massive push to be physically distant but socially connected. So athletes went from having many people watching and interacting with them, coaches, teammates, sports medicine professionals, licensed mental health professionals, teachers, friends, to an abrupt change in their immediate social environment. So, although they still might have had that connection, online or virtual connection is really different as having your teammates, coaches, medical professionals, friends, etc., near you every day. One of the other challenges of moving connection online is that those of us in the medical and mental health professions, we only see them for brief snapshots of time. And that's incredibly different than watching them interact at practice, at weights, just in the hallway with teammates, coaches, medical staff. And so we really have to rely heavily on those brief snapshots when we're interacting with athletes to really get a good sense of how they're doing and how they're managing the stress. Moving to virtual connections also really puts pressure on athletes to do a variety of things, such as reach out to others for connection, accepting those connections that are offered. So if someone sends them a text and said, "Hey, let's chat online," someone who's experiencing some depression or social isolation, that's going to be easier to avoid that virtual connection than it would be to have that conversation with somebody who's sitting right next to them in real life. And it also unfortunately puts a lot of pressure on athletes to reach out and let others know that they're struggling, which is incredibly difficult, especially when we consider that there's a lot of research suggesting that one of the major barriers to mental health treatment for athletes is actually stigma. So they're maybe feeling isolated, lonely, depressed, anxious, and instead of others are kind of approaching them in person and asking how they're doing, as those of us in medical and mental health professions often do, there's that extra barrier of reaching out and saying, "Hey, I'm struggling," or "Hey, I'm not doing well," which is incredibly, incredibly difficult for many athletes. Then we think about, even more broadly, what about those that don't have access to broadband services for online video chats, or even reliable broadband services like in rural communities? Um, or let's say they don't have a safe space to connect online with others where they can really discuss how they're feeling. Maybe they've moved home and there's a challenging home environment where family members might want to cut them off from their social connections, or maybe their family is under financial distress and they need to work long hours to support their family and have minimal time to connect with others. So I think it can be easy for us to think about this generation of athletes, particularly at the high school and collegiate level, are already used to online connections, which is certainly the case, but they those connections are certainly different. As a licensed mental health professional, I transitioned a lot of my services to online, and athletes are absolutely ready and waiting to meet in person again. A lot of them would actually prefer to meet in person rather than meet virtually. And I think that there's also that kind of exhaustion that comes from meeting in virtual connections, and really that crave for those in person connections. Another variable that is absolutely present during the pandemic is academic concerns. Many student athletes had abrupt transition to online learning, classes stopped, or all of a sudden their parents are their homeschool teachers in the case of, certainly high school and middle school athletes. Going back to the NCAA survey, about half of those athletes surveyed felt positive about their ability to keep up with classes during the spring semester, but many are struggling with that online format. Some actually faculty even increased the assignment load after moving their classes online. And that's actually one of the things that I heard pretty consistently from a lot of student athletes that I work with. And even those that are student athletes that I would kind of term high achieving academic student athletes, they were really struggling with how they actually had more assignments, more group activities now that they've transitioned to the online format. So you're taking an already stressful situation and making it even more stressful in the academic realm. Moving academics online can also make it difficult to connect with tutors, academic support, professors, or teachers. So, again, there's a number of logistical barriers or just different ways to reach out and connect that they maybe don't have as much practice with. Um, I think that there's also another layer thinking about academics in the fall. They're really incredibly uncertain. I think a lot of universities and schools, if they do have plans, there's several tiers of plans. Um, and there's different thresholds for being in person or being online. And I think a lot of students and student athletes have pretty strong feelings about not being online, uh, let alone high school and elementary school athletes who are then relying on their parents to be their teachers and thinking about how that increases the stress within the family environment, which then can certainly contribute to mental health and well-being concerns within the home. So that's an incredibly important piece, but also an incredibly stressful piece for student athletes. Then also, and finally, we kind of get to some of the sport related variables. That was just kind of the social context. Now we start to get to some of those sport related variables that are contributing to some of the stress for student athletes. Um, Overall, data really suggests that athletes' physical activity decreased during the pandemic. All of a sudden, athletes are having to think about, where do I go train? How do I go train? You have gyms that are closed, facilities that are closed. I'm a triathlete, a competitive triathlete, and we went without swimming for 2 to 3 months, and it's was not anymore, but was absolutely too cold to be swimming in open water. So swimming was off the table. There was a study by McWine and colleagues that the data actually very recently came out, and it was a survey of approximately 3,200 athletes in Wisconsin, and the data was collected in May 2020 via an online survey. And what he and his colleagues found was that there was a drop in physical activity by 50% in May 2020, which was a significant difference than before May 2020. Very consistent with some of the things that we saw at the collegiate level as well. The NCAA survey found that 80% of respondents reported local regulations and lack of access to appropriate facilities as barriers to their training. Anecdotally, meeting with student athletes, just even finding ways that they could practice sport specific skills or do sport specific training was incredibly difficult. These are athletes that are probably pretty used to pushing around heavy weights, and they literally don't have access to those types of things, and are relying a lot on body weight exercises and body weight activities. The NCAA study also outlined some emotional barriers to training. Approximately 43% of student athletes reported that fear of exposure to COVID was one of the emotional barriers, and these numbers were higher for Black and Latinx populations than for white populations. Lack of motivation was a barrier for training for about 40% of the athletes, stress and anxiety for about 20%, and then sadness or depression for 13%. Then there were also some family or personal responsibilities that made it difficult to train because their time was taken up by other things. And again, this was found in higher rates for Black and Latinx populations than white populations. This is really important to consider because student athletes are used to training and used to training a lot, and I think for a lot of student athletes, they didn't really recognize how important that training was for their mental health and well-being. Certainly, data suggests that physical activity in general is helpful for mental health and well-being, but for a lot of athletes, this can be a primary coping skill for them, especially when we consider kind of the middle school, high school levels. The collegiate level, it can certainly be a coping skill, but it can also be a source of stress as well. um, and so I think not having access to that training schedule in the way that they normally would certainly increase some anxiety, and kind of anxiety about what is my performance going to look like when I return to sport. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those performance concerns. I think, like we've already talked about, athletes experience that disrupted or even no training for several months, depending on their circumstances. This gets even more complicated for athletes who were injured and didn't have access to their rehab facilities. So they might have had access to their sports medicine professionals or athletic trainers asking about how can I do those rehab activities, but that put pressure on sports medicine to be very creative about how can we continue with rehab in a way that's helpful, and even putting pressure on all of you to do virtual appointments. Much like return to play post injury, there's naturally going to be some anxiety and self doubt that surfaces as athletes transition back to sport as the restrictions are lifted. We don't have a lot of data suggesting about what do some of those performance concerns look like post, in a COVID pandemic, but we can look to the injury literature to say, for those that are injured, what might we expect? So relevant factors from the injury literature are loss of physical fitness and effects on technical performance. The major difference that between, I think, the COVID pandemic and the injury literature is that one of the things that surfaces in the injury literature is that athletes will have anxiety about other athletes getting better while they're on the sidelines injured. And I think that's one of the quote unquote benefits, if you can even call it that, about the pandemic, is that everything was on pause for a lot of people. The injury literature also suggests that this kind of uncertainty or concern about performance tends to be present for approximately 6 months post injury as athletes have the opportunity to experience successes again. So, the reason I bring that up is to encourage you to kind of keep your eyes and ears open for quite a while, actually, about certainly at least a semester's plus worth for how our athletes doing. Granted, there's again going to be some restrictions as they transition back to sport, so that might be a little bit disrupted or it might go more quickly. But it's not going to be one of those things. Okay, we're back at practice, everything's better, and we're moving forward. There's just simply going to be some performance concerns that are going to be lingering. This is also where sport and performance psychology can certainly assist you during that process. That's really what we're trained to do, is help athletes kind of mitigate some of those variables and kind of think about those variables in a different way, which we'll certainly talk about in a bit. The other component about performance concerns that can be important is athletes are also returning to competitive environments that have a lot of scrutiny after a period of not experiencing this pressure. I was actually having a conversation with a student athlete who was anxious about going back to sport, because the student athlete said, I haven't been under that level of a microscope in a long period of time, and I forgot how stressful that was. How many athletes have ever have 2 to 3 months with minimal or no training? Very few athletes. Some of them actually might have experienced this as a welcome reprieve from being under the microscope. So that contrast from going from self-directed, self-driven training, non-scrutinized training, back to competitive training where many are watching, many have feedback, is going to be uncomfortable for athletes, or at least an adjustment. And then that gets even further complicated by some coaches have unrealistic expectations for athletes' performance, which can certainly be very stressful for them. So, all of these variables can certainly impact mental health. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of unpack what when we're talking about mental health, what are some of those levels of mental health that we're talking about? So many athletes, or a number of athletes, had pre existing mental health conditions and were actively seeking mental health treatment, but also had pretty significant and immediate disruption in their mental health care, especially at the collegiate level when they just maybe abruptly had to go home. Best case scenario was that athletes could continue meeting with their mental health professionals via telehealth. But again, do athletes have reliable access to internet, a safe and quiet place to meet? Um, you know, they might be living at home with a parent who's very concerned or doesn't even know that they're in mental health treatment, especially at the collegiate level, and then have to navigate those variables, and try to figure out, how do I still meet with my licensed mental health professional under these conditions? Many college athletes, especially, had to move states, and the way things often work for licensed mental health professionals is we have to be mindful about whether we are able to practice in another jurisdiction, potentially where we're not licensed. So I know when COVID hit and the college athletes went home, there was a scramble at the licensed mental health professional level to figure out, how can I practice interjurisdictionally? How how can I practice interjurisdictionally but also legally? How can I find referrals for athletes that are closer to home? Those types of things, let alone access to medication or funds to pay for treatment. There's also athletes who had a new onset of mental health concerns. The study put out by the NCAA suggested that only 50 to 60% of collegiate student athletes knew how to access mental health support in their area that they were in. This was lower for those living alone, lower for men and women of color, and lower for those with unstable financial situations. And the reality is steps to access mental health care when student athletes are not in their typical sport environment, there's going to be barriers. You guys, as athletic training professionals, as licensed mental health professionals, coaches, we're all watching and can notice those difficulties, and likely have good referral procedures put in place. But then they move to another state, or we don't have as frequent contact. What do those referral procedures look like? So I think the other piece that's important to remember is that these athletes may be coming back to campus, or coming back to training, or coming back to sport with higher mental health concerns than we realize. And we must be aware of this, and ready to respond, and to talk about and have those discussions with athletes. Then there's also the COVID specific mental health concerns. Athletes might experience anxiety about getting sick. I was talking with a colleague who talked about, she was working with some individuals who were part of ball sport, and prior to things being shut down for the pandemic, these teammates were actually very concerned about touching the same ball because they didn't want to get sick, and were covering their mouths with their shirts, and so just that anxiety about, I don't want to get sick. Some of that concern about getting sick is concerned about their own sickness, but it also might be concerned about getting sick and then unintentionally infecting others. I've talked to a number of student athletes who were concerned about being around family members who were at risk for more severe consequences of COVID, the concern about being an asymptomatic carrier and what happens if I get my family member sick and something happens, heaven forbid that they died because of COVID and that I gave it to them. And so there's just a heightened awareness of the impact that this has on us. And another challenge is that everyone has different levels of risk that they're willing to assume. So as athletes are coming back to sport and coming back to campus, they're going to be interacting with teammates, coaches, friends who all have different levels of risk that they're willing to assume, and potentially be put into a spot where they have to make a choice or set a boundary with others. Or maybe parents have different risk levels than the kid. Maybe the kid is more concerned about getting sick than parents are, or parents are more concerned about the kid getting sick than the kid is. And so there's a lot more things that we have to navigate and a lot more conversations that we have to have. And then finally, the mental health of family members. Many student athletes were at home, and more frequently with their parents, whether we're talking about the high school or the collegiate level. And these family members might also have pre-existing or new onset mental health concerns. That will absolutely impact the mental health and well-being of athletes. Going back to the ACEs, mental health, a parental mental health concern is actually one of those ACEs, especially if it's an untreated mental health concern. Certainly, things like substance use, eating disorders, anxiety, depression, those are certainly at risk for increasing during this time. So as we talk about just the different ways mental health can kind of manifest, let's go ahead and take a look at what the data tells us about the presence of mental health symptoms of adolescent and college student athletes during the time of COVID. Unfortunately, there's been a couple of researchers that have actually looked at that. So these are some slides from a study that I referenced earlier, and that I certainly chatted with the researcher about reproducing these slides, and he graciously allowed me to share these slides with you. This is the data from the online study of approximately 3,200 high school athletes in Wisconsin. They measured anxiety levels using the GAD-7, which is a popular screening measure. And basically what they found is that 65% of high school athletes in Wisconsin reported anxiety symptoms in May 2020. That is an incredibly high amount of high school athletes experiencing anxiety. Although it's not reflected in this data, when I had a conversation with the primary researcher, he noted that they have data from 46 of 50 states, and he noted similar trends throughout the nation. So although this is just data specific to the state of Wisconsin, this was pretty consistent across the board. And unfortunately, there's a couple of manuscripts submitted that I'm really excited to take a look at once they're out for publication. They also took a look at symptoms of depression measured by the PHQ-9, which is, again, a very common measure used to screen for mental health difficulties in athlete and non-athlete populations. And what they found, again, was 68% reported symptoms of depression in May 2020. And if you look at the graphs, the red is the May 2020 data, so the COVID data, for lack of a better term, and the yellow data is historical data. So these rates of depression are a lot higher than the historical data that they had, and found that moderate to severe depression was 3.5 times higher during May 2020 for high school athletes in Wisconsin, which is pretty astounding. The NCAA also took a look at some mental health data in their COVID-19 well-being survey. If you work with college populations, I didn't really encourage you to take a look at this data. It's actually available on the NCAA research website. And they basically gathered this data from April 10th to May 1st. Approximately 37,000 student athletes completed the questionnaire. And this data was collected approximately 1 month after winter championships and spring sports were canceled. And basically, look at these rates, and they're incredibly high rates of mental health symptoms that student athletes are reporting. They also found that over 1/3 of student athletes reported experiencing sleep difficulties, and 1 in 12 student athletes reported feeling so depressed it was difficult to function constantly or almost every day. That is an incredibly high number of student athletes. Mental health concerns were highest, again, of student athletes of color. Higher for those whose families were facing economic hardship, and higher for those living alone. So again, those disparities are noted across the board. This quote was taken from the NCAA research study, and I added the bold and the underline, but essentially the rates of mental health concerns were, for the most part, 150 to 250% higher than historically reported by NCAA student athletes, which is astounding. Seniors and underclassmen reported similar rates of symptoms in general. More seniors tended to endorse feeling sad and a sense of loss, which makes sense. But across the board, student athletes at the collegiate level were struggling. Interestingly, two types of mental health concerns weren't examined that are likely on the rise are substance abuse and eating disorders or disordered eating. So it'd be interesting to see some of those rates. I suspect that some of that data has been collected and hopefully will be coming out from the various entities at some point. But the reason that those are important to watch for, the eating disorders and substance use are essentially maladaptive coping responses that typically flare up during times of uncertainty or feeling a lack of control. I came across some survey data actually today suggesting that that people had experienced an increase, 31% more people were reporting symptoms of alcohol use during the pandemic. And so in non-athlete populations, we see those increase. So it makes sense that we'd see that for athlete populations too. And so, after we outline all those mental health symptoms, to think that when sports start that all of these symptoms are just going to disappear, that's incredibly short-sighted. It would be wonderful. I hope for all the student athletes that that's the case. I just don't think that that's actually going to be the case, because it's been an incredibly time of high pressure, stress, uncertainty. Or what could potentially be even more challenging is, what if athletes think that these symptoms are going to go away when sports start and they don't? Where does that leave them? They might have been really holding on to, I'm going to feel better when sports start. Heaven forbid that continues, or maybe even they feel worse. So I think that really highlights why it's incredibly important for us to have this dialogue, and for all of you to be empowered with what are tools and resources that you can give to your athletes. So that's a lot of stuff. If you're feeling overwhelmed, uncomfortable, uncertain, that pit in your stomach, totally okay. Pretty appropriate response given the circumstances. It probably tells me that you are listening and taking this data seriously, because it can be a little bit unsettling or a little uncertain. But that's why we're doing this talk. I'm here to help with that, and here to help you and help empower you with resources, or at the very least, very cute pictures of my dogs, or I think they're very cute pictures of my dogs. So what are some things that you can do to help? So one of the most important variables, I think, would be to have a lot of patience with your student athletes. There is simply going to be an adjustment period. We might see that adjustment period immediately when they return to sport. We might see that as sport progresses. We might see that as school starts. There might be several different transition points. Everyone's going to have varying levels of fitness, motivation, stress, well-being, financial and nutritional resources, anxiety, confidence, self-doubt, experiences of marginalization and oppression. And there's also going to be many new procedures to follow and a lot to do. But it is going to be well worth your time to check in about the well-being of your athletes when they return. Recognize that what you might experience as resistance might actually be based in fear or uncertainty. Athletes may be nervous or scared to play due to fears of illness, but also feel pressured to play because of parents, scholarship status, coaches, teammates. And overall, the sooner that we can address these symptoms of mental health and well-being, the better things are going to be for our athletes. The more resources that we can put in place, or the more that we can normalize some of these symptoms, or normalize these symptoms and let them know that there are things to help get them on the track that they want to be on, and give them coping skills, the better. Have conversations with athletes about what you notice and your concerns. I would encourage you to not just chalk everything up to a pandemic response. Let them know that you notice and that there are resources to help. And know that sometimes these conversations happen multiple times and over the course of days or weeks. But them knowing that you're there and knowing that you're concerned and knowing that you're a resource is incredibly important for them. Within that, it's also important to be realistic. And there's two important ways to be realistic: what's going to happen environmentally and what's going to happen psychologically. The reality is we don't know a lot. We have plans in place, we have protocols, we have procedures, but we really do not know what the fall is going to look like. We don't know how sports are going to proceed. We don't know what's going to happen with campus or with school. And I really want to encourage all of you that if you don't know the answer to something, don't promise it. One of the things that was really interesting when the pandemic first hit is that thoughts spread as if they were certainty like wildfire. So, athletes would be like, "Oh, do you hear so and so? Like, yep, we're actually gonna have this track meet, or wait, no, so sports aren't canceled." And during that uncertainty, we want to latch on to any sort of data that we can. So be careful about giving false hope to your athletes. We need to model realistic expectations, and saying that there's going to be no changes to sports, academic, social interactions is simply not realistic. It's okay to say we don't know. It's okay to embrace that that's uncomfortable. So going back to mental health and being realistic about mental health, the numbers of athletes experiencing symptoms is decently high. And like I've said numerous times, it's possible that some of these symptoms are going to disappear, but probably not going to be the case for most athletes. So it's also very important to be realistic with athletes about what to expect about mental health concerns, emotions, stressors, etc. They're going back into a competitive environment and they're not feeling their best, which is going to feel uncomfortable. Some might transition and handle this well, others might not. So, helping them set realistic goals. It's okay that they're frustrated. How can they work toward where they want to be? And again, this is where working hand in hand with licensed mental health professionals and sport and performance psychologists can be very, very helpful. Along the lines of being realistic is communication. Share your plans and guidelines widely, post them online. If you don't know, do not speculate. Just simply say you're not sure. Like I said already, times of uncertainty, speculation is treated as fact and spreads like wildfire. And then that contributes to that emotional roller coaster that athletes experience. Also, be mindful about not bombarding athletes and families with too much information. Find and share the most appropriate and meaningful pieces of information. During the pandemic, especially about the end of March, beginning of April, I would literally get 75 to 100 emails about resources, information, updates about the pandemic, which was just, I love resources, but a bit much. And remember that that's probably going to be the case for a lot of people that you're working with. So find the good stuff, share the good stuff, so they're more apt to look at it when you share it because you're not sharing too much information. And then, communication again goes back to keep talking and checking in with athletes to see how they're doing. And that's just the reality now, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because I think the more that we're able to do that and have those conversations in real time, that will actually start to decrease some of that stigma that we see with athletes. Also, really want to encourage all of us to demonstrate flexibility. Adaptation and flexibility is going to be the name of the game this fall and potentially going forward. Like I've said, we've genuinely have no idea what's going to happen. And one of the challenges to make sure we don't get tied up in is we've started playing sports, so sports are fully a go now. But the reality is we could return to sport only to have it abruptly stop again. Will that be disappointing? Absolutely. I absolutely miss sports being in full swing. We don't have control over that though, because we don't necessarily make those broader global decisions. We make more personalized decisions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But we don't have control over those big things. We have to focus on the controllables for ourselves. Many protocols, especially in the academic realm, offer multiple paths. Yes, there might be a preference for one path or the other, but really encouraging athletes to not get tied to one or the other. And want to really encourage all of us to think about, moving forward as an opportunity to plan ahead. So with the abrupt transition home and seizing of everything due to COVID, we have this opportunity for data collection. We saw how we responded during the first shutdown. Again, it might be the only shutdown, I don't know, but that can be a time where we can really ask ourselves what worked, what didn't work, and how can we do things better. So asking athletes what was difficult for them with the surprise of the pandemic. How can they put things into place to minimize that being difficult for them going forward, especially if they experience it again? What are some of their strengths that they can use and capitalize on and make sure they're continually doing, and really maximize those strengths going forward? I love taking challenges as opportunities to learn about ourselves. And so we have a lot of really interesting data that we can use to maybe give us a little bit more personal certainty as to how we're going to respond to things moving forward, which brings me to the next thing: control the controllables. What are some of those things that we can control? We can control training safely. We can control maintaining physical distancing guidelines. We can control seeking social connection in physically distanced ways. We can control whether we seek opportunities for personal development and growth. Interestingly, these factors are all incredibly, incredibly important within the sport and performance environment. This is literally what I do on a regular basis with athletes, is helping them figure out how can we maximize our strengths, how can we grow our weaknesses, and how can we influence things that we're able to influence for ourselves. The other thing about controlling the controllables is acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean that you actually like what's going on, quite the opposite. It means that you acknowledge that those are the circumstances, so then you can respond effectively. And so oftentimes athletes will fight against, oh, but I don't want it this way. I don't want it to be this way, and kind of push back against that. It's this way whether we like it or not. The world shut down whether we liked it or not. Sports were on pause whether we liked it or not. And so when we accept that and say, okay, sports are returning, but I have to wear this mask, or I have to fill out this survey. Okay, how can I do that, and use that maybe as an opportunity to reflect on how is my mindset around doing things that I don't like to do? Am I pulling that stress forward with me, or am I trying to decrease that stress that I'm experiencing? Um, I think the more that we can also use this as opportunities to accept emotions, accept that emotions are normal responses to uncertainty, can be helpful. This can be a time that we use this to keep our perspectives in check and our goals realistic, and reminders to go back and revisit some of those goals that we have for a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And really, it's this other great opportunity that we can learn new skills to respond effectively to emotions that arrive with uncertainty. That's absolutely going to be helpful for sport performance. I'm somebody who I like to do a lot of things. I like to be really busy. And so when sports went on pause, that was certainly something that was a little bit disruptive for me. And so I was certainly still working with athletes, but that work looked a little bit different. And so one of the things that I had to do was stop and think, okay, what are some other ways that I can be helpful, even though sports aren't happening right now? So that's where I reached out to a lot of people, did other public speaking opportunities or webinars or educational events for people. And that was a way that I could still live out my values in a way that was helpful and meaningful for those that I enjoy serving. One really great thing, and I actually do mean this with all sincerity, is that with COVID, we are actually really talking about mental health, and mental health is just part of that discussion that we're having. I think the movements have already been in sports that we're having those conversations more and more, but with COVID, it's almost been a necessity to talk about mental health. So we are absolutely ready, willing, and want to be part of that dialogue with you. So absolutely coordinate with your mental health team. And if you don't have a mental health team or don't have mental health colleagues, by all means, reach out and get some. I have some resources for you to be able to find them. Talk to your licensed mental health professionals about what you anticipate and how they can be helpful. Mental health providers or mental health professionals, especially those with sport experience, can be an important part, providing you and your athletes with education about what to expect upon return to sport. Ideally, mental health symptom evaluation would be part of the return to play protocol for all athletes. I know some organizations are doing that, some aren't, but simply a check-in about how are our athletes doing emotionally is going to be really, really important from my perspective. Mental health professionals can provide mental health interventions, or they can provide provide interventions focused on the mental aspects of performance. I'm actually doing a lot of mental aspects of performance work with athletes currently. And those things look like goal setting, so helping athletes identify where they'd like to be and breaking down steps to get there, helping them manage performance anxiety given the disruption in their training, helping them manage confidence and self-doubt, and also helping them foster psychological flexibility in dealing with uncertainty. Licensed mental health professionals, I think we oftentimes think that it's kind of the traditional therapy picture that I have here. We're sitting in an office, sitting down across the room from someone. Typically, we imagine a couch, and certainly that can be some of the work, but it can also be brief interventions. It can be team interventions. It can be virtual interventions. Um, it, Oftentimes, those of us that work in sport and performance psychology, we're really interested in providing practical, helpful interventions, and are used to doing it in a quick manner. There's not a lot of extra time in sports, so that's part of what we're used to doing. Certainly, if athletes do want longer term interventions and do want traditional mental health care, that's also part of what we provide as well, but it doesn't have to look like that. Also, educational talks, webinars, that's a huge part of what we do as well. And if you do have a mental health team with whom you work or professionals with whom you work, this is also a great time to really refine your referral procedures and include licensed mental health professionals in your process. I was talking to an athletic trainer with whom I work on the regular, and he reached out and he's like, hey, what's your protocol given the pandemic, telehealth, not telehealth, et cetera. And so we kind of walked through what that looks like and how we can best work with the student athletes going forward, given that not all services or probably very few services are actually in person. So if you don't have any mental health professionals or want to grow the number of mental health professionals on your team, these are a couple of great resources for you. The first one is to reach out to people in your state psychological association. So every state has a psychological association. North Dakota, it's called North Dakota Psychological Association. Minnesota is called Minnesota Psychological Association. And typically they have a searchable function where you can see licensed mental health professionals or psychologists that are part of their organization. The Association for Applied Sports Psychology also is another great resource. So there's two types of people that you can find through ASP's directory. One is licensed mental health professionals who also have training in sport and performance, which is myself. I'm licensed to treat mental health difficulties, but I also have a certified mental performance designation, which is a sports psychology specialty. So I can do both I can treat mental health difficulties and then do sport and performance work. There's also people who are not licensed mental health professionals but do have that CMPC designation. They are able to do performance work but not treat mental health difficulties. So if you're looking for people to treat mental health difficulties, make sure that you look for licensed mental health professionals as part of that directory. Some other mental health and performance resources that I think are super helpful. I don't have any financial interest in any of these. One of my favorite books is The Confidence Gap. It's a great book related to sport performance, but it also has a lot of mental health related a lot of things that can be helpful in the mental health realm. The author is Russ Harris, and he also has this great handout and talk that's about 9 minutes long called Face COVID. It's 9 tangible steps regarding how to respond. Just Google Russ Harris Face COVID and you'll find it. He's got great work. Hilinski's Hope has a wonderful podcast called United. Typically, the people that are on the podcast are licensed mental health professionals with sport and performance experience and training. Association for Applied Sports Psychology has some great blog posts about COVID, about recent racialized events. And then there's a couple of apps. COVID Coach is put out by the VA, actually, and it's just an app to help support mental health, coping skills, etc. And then Cyber Guide is actually basically a kind of a review site for different apps about mental health apps, because it's important to be mindful about how we use apps, how to use data, whether they're supported by empirical research and whatnot. And so the thing is with apps, I always like to give the caveat, they're not a replacement for mental health treatment with licensed professionals, but can be a helpful adjunct. And so Cyber Guide can be a great resource for vetting some of those apps and make sure that they're actually helpful. The other piece that I'd really encourage you all to do is have a mental health transition plan. Given about 55% of women and 60% of male student athletes knew how to access mental health support in their area, this tells us we need to be proactive active in the event that student athletes, especially at the collegiate level, are sent home again. Again, these numbers are even lower for those living alone and lower for student athletes of color. This is especially the case for those that we know need mental health support. If they're already in mental health treatment, coordinate with their licensed mental health professional to identify a transition plan should they have to return home again. Talk with your counseling centers and other resources on campus. Medication prescribers, what's the plan moving forward? How do they get medications refilled in another state? What does that look like? And remember, yes, telehealth is probably going to be an option. Most licensed mental health professionals do telehealth now, but what are some of those barriers to accessing telehealth? Do they have reliable and consistent internet access, a device they can use, a safe and quiet place? And if they're not sure about those things, that can be really where problem solving some of those barriers or anticipating some of those barriers should we have to transition can be really helpful. Ideally, this is already the mental health transition plan is already a part of your mental health policies and procedures. If it's not, really encourage you to start that discussion with some of your colleagues and your supervisors and your mentors. The reality is, like I've said several times, we cannot promise there won't be an abrupt return home again. So we have to be prepared in the event that that's the case. And then the last resource that I really want you to think about, and is probably the most important resource, is make sure that you have culturally informed and multicultural resources available for your student athletes. Research actually suggests that cultural identity is a protective factor against racial trauma. So this is where really knowing your community, college, university, and national resources for athletes of color, or resources for athletes from marginalized groups, can be very, very important. Fortunately, as racial disparities and social justice has moved to the forefront of conversation, there are numerous resources online available for Black, Indigenous people of color, for white allies, for white passing allies. And so there's a lot of really good stuff out there right now. And to make sure we're consuming those resources and sharing those resources is really, really important. We really want to make sure that we're supporting the athletes from marginalized communities, supporting their mental health and well-being as much as possible. And, as I talked about already, another fortunate part of COVID is many mental health practitioners have an online practice now. And this is really helpful when we're considering multicultural resources. So that means that if there's not someone with a specific competency in your immediate area, there's likely to be someone who has that competency within your state or who can practice legally within your state. So helping athletes from marginalized communities access those really important resources and those providers that have those competencies is really, really beneficial. So some resources for diversity and cultural competence. This Black, Indigenous, People of Color Mental Health Resource Guide is fantastic. I think it's about 7 or 8 pages of resources. Wonderful, wonderful resource for any student athletes that you work with who are student athletes of color. The Ask Diversity and Cultural Competence Committee has resources online, not only related to race and ethnicity, but also LGBTQI, gender, and then they're also gathering information about community activism and a resource list related to that. Racial Equity Tools is another helpful website. Liberate is an app that is a meditation app specifically for the Black, Indigenous, people of color community. And then The Safe Place is a minority mental health app that educates and raises more awareness in the Black community about mental health. So another very helpful app. Again, the caveat with apps is they're not a replacement for mental health treatment, but they can certainly, like I said, be a helpful adjunct, or also even help kind of normalize mental health concerns and just have those kind of help athletes think about what mental health concerns might look like for them and what reaching out might look like for them. And the very last thing that I want to leave you all with is, hopefully this entire presentation helped you recognize really what my point of this presentation is, which is people first, athletes second. Yes, sports are awesome. Yes, they want to perform well and do well in their sport. But if we have to consider them people first and foremost. If we don't recognize, see, support people first, it's going to be really, really hard to perform well. And so I wanted to provide you with a broader context to consider athlete mental health and well-being, and then also resources very specific that could help you foster mental health and well-being, or start those dialogues with your diverse student athlete bodies, because I think it's certainly very important, not only within the context of sport but also beyond. So that is my quick dive into athlete mental health in the time of COVID. I want to thank you all for joining me for this conversation. And certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. This is my website, social media. I'm more than happy to interact with anyone, or also help direct you toward any resources going forward. So thank you for your time.